Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, today we are going to discuss sodium hydroxide. In this lecture, we will discuss what is sodium hydroxide, what are the uses of sodium hydroxide, and also we will discuss what are the methods which will be used to synthesize sodium hydroxide. In these methods, we will discuss chlor-alkali process, and we also discuss different cells by which we perform chlor-alkali process. These cells are diaphragm cell, Mercury cell, and membrane cell. Now, first of all, what is sodium hydroxide? Sodium hydroxide is the principal strong base used in the chemical industry. In bulk, it is most often handled as aqueous solution, since solutions are cheaper and easier to handle. Sodium hydroxide is also used for manufacture of sodium salts and detergents, for pH regulation, and for organic synthesis. Dear students, in chemical industry, we can use sodium hydroxide as base for the preparation of different chemicals, and also we can use sodium hydroxide as a sodium salt and detergents. Sodium hydroxide is also being used for the pH regulation. And the next point is, sodium hydroxide is employed to digest tissues such as in a process that were used with the farm animals at one time. This process involved placing a carcass into a sealed chamber, then adding a mixture of sodium hydroxide with water. This eventually turned the body into a liquid with a coffee-like appearance, and the only solid that remain are bones hulls, which could be crushed between one's fingerprints or fingertips. Students, in this point, he said that sodium hydroxide is used to digest tissues. For this purpose, we place carcass in a chamber and then we pour sodium hydroxide on it. That sodium hydroxide convert those carcass or digest them, convert in these carcass into coffee-like liquid. And the remaining things are just bones, which are very soft now, which can be crushed by fingertips or fingerprints. So this is the main introduction of sodium hydroxide, in which we have discussed about the sodium hydroxide, that sodium hydroxide is a principal base. And the second point is that sodium hydroxide can be used to digest tissues. Now we are going to discuss chlor-alkali process, and our topic is manufacture of sodium hydroxide and chlorine by the chlor-alkali process. First of all, its introduction. Before the electrolytic method of making sodium hydroxide and chlorine, chlor-alkali process became widely used. Sodium hydroxide was made from soda ash by lime soda process. This soda ash as aqueous Na2CO3 is reacted with slaked lime CaOH twice according to the following equation. Dear student, in this point he said that before that chlor-alkali process, sodium hydroxide was prepared by soda ash process, in which sodium hydroxide is prepared by soda ash and slaked lime. In this, we allowed sodium carbonate to react with slaked lime and form sodium hydroxide. Equation is given below. Here, sodium carbonate react with calcium hydroxide and form sodium hydroxide along with calcium carbonate. The chlor-alkali process has gradually replaced the lime soda process. And at the end, he said that the chlor-alkali process, which we are going to discuss, replaced the lime soda process for the preparation of sodium hydroxide. So dear students, in this we have discussed 2 points. First one is that before chlor-alkali process we used lime soda process, in which we react soda ash with calcium hydroxide or slaked lime, in which by the reaction of sodium carbonate and calcium hydroxide, in the soda lime process, sodium carbonate react with calcium hydroxide and form sodium hydroxide along with calcium carbonate. This is the first point. And the second point is that chlor-alkali process replaced the lime soda process. Why it replaced the lime soda process? We will discuss it in our lecture in next slides. Now dear students, we are going to discuss chlor-alkali process in detail, where we will discuss that chlor-alkali word came from where, and we also discuss how can we prepare sodium hydroxide by using chlor-alkali process. And the first point is the term chlor-alkali refer to the two chemicals chlorine and analkali, which are simultaneously produced as a result of electrolysis of brine. Dear students, he said that the chlor-alkali word refer to the two chemicals. It means chlor-alkali word point out two chemicals, which are two chemicals. As you see from the name, chlor means chlorine, alkali means alkali or a base, which are produced simultaneously as a result of electrolysis of brine. So these two chemicals means chlorine and sodium hydroxide produced simultaneously by the electrolysis of brine. So here are the two important terms. First of all is electrolysis and the second one is brine. So what is electrolysis? Electrolysis is a process or the decomposition of a compound by using electric current or by passing electric current. And brine is the solution of sodium chloride in a water. So when you will pass the electric current through the solution of sodium chloride in water, then sodium hydroxide and chlorine will be produced. And the next point is the most common chlor-alkali chemicals are chlorine and sodium hydroxide, caustic soda, which is also known as, but can include potassium hydroxide when potassium brine is used. Dear student, he said that the most common and the most important chemicals in the chlor-alkali process are sodium hydroxide. As we said that by passing electric current through the brine, we will prepare sodium hydroxide and chlorine. And that point is explained here, that by passing electric current, we will have two main chemicals. The first one is sodium hydroxide and the second one is chlorine. He also said that you can say that at the place of sodium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide. But for the potassium hydroxide, as you use sodium chloride for the making brine, then for making sodium hydroxide, you will use potassium chloride, so that you will have potassium hydroxide as a base and chlorine. These are the two important points for the chlor-alkali process. The first one is two chemicals which referred the name of chlor-alkali process, chlorine and alkali. And the second point is that in this process, more common chemicals are sodium hydroxide and chlorine. He also said that you can prepare potassium hydroxide by using the brine of potassium chloride. And the next one is raw material. Dear students, as you know that, how can you prepare brine? You know that brine is a solution of sodium chloride in a water. And as it is dissolved in water and electric current will pass through it, it will separate it into its ions like sodium ion, hydroxyl ion, chlorine ion and hydrogen ion. As you have the knowledge of these ions, then you can write raw material easily. In our raw material, the first point is chlor-alkali industry uses rock salt as a natural deposit of sodium chloride. The aqueous sodium chloride solution referred to the brine contains sodium ion, chloride ion, hydrogen ion and hydroxyl ion. As I said that the brine is the solution of sodium chloride, he said that we can prepare brine by using rock salt and we prepare aqueous solution, and that aqueous solution is known as brine, and that aqueous solution contains 4 types of charges. The first one is sodium ion, second one is chloride ion, third one is hydrogen ion, and the fourth one is hydroxyl ion. And the next point is electrolysis of this solution produce simultaneously chlorine and sodium hydroxide and hydrogen in the ratio. What is the meaning of this point? He said that by the electrolysis, these ions are separated and now these ions will travel toward their electrodes, means cathode and anode. And at that electrodes, sodium ion will be converted into sodium hydroxide and the chlorine ion will be converted into chlorine. So at different electrodes or different products will form. At one electrode, sodium hydroxide will form, and at the second electrode, chlorine will form, and these both products have different ratios. So dear students, in this raw material, we have discussed 2 points. The first one is we use rock salt for the preparation of brine, and by the electrolysis, it contains 4 types of ions. And the second point is that sodium hydroxide and chlorine will be produced at different electrodes and in different ratio. Now students, we are going to discuss complete process in chlor-alkali process by the help of reactions. And the first point is brine electrolysis produces chlorine at the anode and hydrogen along with alkali hydroxide at the cathode. The 2 products are removed in separate streams. Dear students, in this point, he said that by the brine electrolysis, they will produce chlorine at the anode and hydrogen and sodium hydroxide at the cathode. As you know that, dear students, chlorine has a negative charge. It will move toward the anode and hydrogen and sodium has positive charge, and these 2 will move toward the cathode. At cathode, they will reduce and convert it into sodium hydroxide, and at anode, chlorine will oxidize and convert it into chlorine molecule. So in this point, we said that chlorine is produced at anode and hydrogen and sodium hydroxides are produced at cathode. And the next point is the overall chemical reaction of electrolysis of sodium hydroxide or sodium chloride, is NaCl will react with water. It means you are forming solution or brine solution. Then it will form sodium hydroxide, chlorine and hydrogen at different electrodes. Here, these chemicals are necessary to separate. If you will not remove chlorine, this will lead the side product. What will be the side product? And the point is, if chlorine is not separated from sodium hydroxide, side reactions such as following would occur. Sodium hydroxide will react with chlorine and it will form sodium oxychloride or sodium hypochlorite and sodium chloride and water. If you will not remove chlorine, then it will react with your product and will form sodium oxychloride or sodium hypochlorite with your salt. This chlorine can also react with hydrogen and can form hydrogen chloride. And the next point is, three processes are used: the diaphragm cell process, the membrane cell process, and the Mercury cell process. Dear students, for the chlor-alkali process, three cell processes are used, and the first one is diaphragm cell process, second one is membrane cell process, and the third one is Mercury cell process. So this was the complete introduction of chlor-alkali process, in which we have discussed what is chlor-alkali process, from where that chlor-alkali word came. We also discussed that there are two important chemicals in the chlor-alkali process, and we also discussed that how chlorine and sodium hydroxide and hydrogen are produced at different electrodes. We also discussed that if we will not remove chlorine, what will be the effect of chlorine on our product. So students, here is the representation of three cell processes: diaphragm cell process, membrane cell process, and the Mercury cell process. First one is diaphragm cell process. In diaphragm cell process, you can see that there are two electrodes, anode and cathode. Anode is shown in red color and the cathode is shown in gray color. There is the separation between these two electrodes by green dotted line. That green dotted line is asbestos diaphragm. Now, in the membrane cell process, here are also two electrodes. The first one is anode and the second one is cathode. Anode is shown by red color and the cathode is shown by gray color. Here is the separation of these two electrodes by membrane. That's why this process is known as membrane cell process, and diaphragm cell process was known as diaphragm cell process due to the separation between these two electrodes by asbestos diaphragm. And the next one is Mercury cell process. Here you can see that anode is red color and cathode is gray color. Here the thing which is very important is that in Mercury cell process you are using the cathode of mercury, due to which this process is known as Mercury cell process. So in this we have discussed three things. First one is diaphragm cell is known as diaphragm cell due to the separation of two electrodes by diaphragm. The membrane cell process is known as membrane cell process due to the separation between two electrodes of membrane. And Mercury cell process is known as Mercury cell process due to the cathode of mercury. So next we will discuss diaphragm cell, Mercury cell and membrane cell one by one. Now we are going to discuss one by one this cell process. The first process is Mercury cell process. In the Mercury cell process, a flowing pool of mercury at the bottom of electrolytic cell serves as cathode. The anodes are graphite or modified titanium. When an electric current passes through the prime, chlorine is produced at the anode and sodium dissolved in mercury, forming an amalgam of sodium and mercury. The amalgam is then poured into a separate vessel where it decomposes into sodium and mercury. What is the meaning of these 3 points? In the first point, he said that in the Mercury cell process, the flowing pool of mercury at the bottom acts as cathode. In electrolytic cell, a flowing pool of mercury acts as cathode and the anode is formed of graphite or modified titanium. Now, what will be the process in that cell and what happened to the prime when electrolysis occurred? When electric current passed, chlorine produced at the anode. Now, what will happen to the sodium? Sodium will be dissolved in mercury, which was acting as cathode, and by dissolving in mercury, it will form sodium amalgam or amalgam of sodium or mercury. Now, how can we separate that sodium from the mercury? For this purpose, we will pour that amalgam into vessels and left them for the decomposition. As that amalgam will decompose, it will be converted into sodium and mercury. Dear students, in this slide, we have discussed 3 points. The first one is mercury will act as a cathode. Second one is that sodium will be dissolved in mercury and will form amalgam, sodium and mercury amalgam. And that amalgam, third point is that amalgam is poured into vessels and let them allow to decompose. As it will be decomposed, then it will be converted into sodium and mercury. Now, How that sodium is converted into sodium hydroxide we will discuss in next slide. As we have discussed in the previous slide that sodium amalgam will be formed and that sodium amalgam will be decomposed into sodium and mercury because that amalgam is formed of sodium and mercury. Now, what will be the cell reactions in this process? We will discuss one by one here. The amalgam of mercury and sodium alloy is taken to a different vessel for decomposition. As we have discussed earlier, for the decomposition, that mercury sodium alloy or the amalgam will decompose and will be converted into sodium and mercury. Now, what will be the reaction or what will be the reaction equation? Here in the figure, you can see that sodium and mercury, which is also known as mercury sodium alloy or the sodium mercury amalgam, will react with water and form sodium hydroxide, hydrogen and mercury. Here he said that as sodium and mercury will be decomposed, sodium is separated now, mercury is separated now, that sodium will react with the hydroxyl of water and form sodium hydroxide, and along with hydrogen and mercury which was separated earlier. Now the next point is, initially the mercury cells seem to be dominant the field because it produced high quality products. With exactly the required amount of water added, a 50% sodium hydroxide solution is formed, which does not greatly require much evaporation for concentration. However, mercury cell use much more electric energy than diaphragm cell and membrane cell. This is the point which will show that why we does not use mercury cell, because it uses more energy as compared to diaphragm cell and membrane cell. And the next point is, small quantities of mercury discharge into nearby streams. These discharges were found to be source of carcinogenic methyl mercury. This has led to prohibition and gradual replacement of mercury cell by diaphragm cells. The first point is that we does not use mercury cell because it uses more energy as compared to diaphragm cell and the membrane cell. And the second point is that because the mercury is discharged during this process and that mercury produce methyl mercury which is carcinogenic. So due to this reason, that mercury cells are replaced by the diaphragm cells. Here in this slide we have discussed the chemical equation for the formation of sodium hydroxide and the two reasons behind the using of diaphragm cell and membrane cell instead of mercury cell. Here are the reactions at the anode and at the cathode. As you will pass electric current through brine, it will produce ions and that ions will move toward their respective electrodes. As chlorine has a negative charge and anode has a positive charge, that chlorine will move toward anode, and at anode it will oxidize and convert it into chlorine molecule. As you know that there is oxidation at anode. At cathode, as you know that sodium has a positive charge and cathode has a negative charge, that sodium ion will move toward the cathode, and at cathode it will accept the electrons, it will reduce and convert it into sodium mercury amalgam, because that sodium will be dissolved into the mercury, that is flowing mercury, which was acting as a cathode, and it will convert it into sodium mercury amalgam. Now that amalgam will poured into the vessels and allowed it to decompose. When it will decompose, it will convert it into mercury and sodium, and that will react with the water and produce sodium hydroxide along with hydrogen and mercury. And the overall reaction is given at the end. NaCl aqueous solution will be converted into sodium mercury amalgam and chlorine. That sodium mercury amalgam is prepared at cathode and chlorine is prepared at anode. So these are basic three reactions which occurred in mercury cell. The first one is at anode, chlorine converted into chlorine molecule, in chlorine gas. At cathode, sodium is converted into sodium ion is converted into sodium mercury amalgam, because that sodium is dissolved in mercury, which will form sodium mercury amalgam, and that sodium mercury amalgam is being converted into sodium and mercury, and the overall reaction is given below, in which NaCl is directly converted into sodium mercury amalgam and chlorine gas. After the discussion of mercury cell, in which we have said that there are two electrodes, anode and cathode. Anode is formed of graphite or the modified titanium, and cathode is formed of mercury. When electric current is passed through the cell, chlorine will be produced at anode and sodium hydroxide is produced at cathode side, because in first step sodium mercury amalgam will form, and then that sodium mercury amalgam will react with water and form sodium hydroxide along with hydrogen and mercury. We also discussed in that process that we prefer diaphragm cell and membrane cell over mercury cell, because mercury cell use more energy as compared to both of these cells. We also said that mercury cell produce methyl mercury carcinogenic compounds, so that mercury cell is replaced by diaphragm cell. Now our next topic is diaphragm cell. First of all, what is diaphragm cell? These cells contain a diaphragm, usually made of asbestos fibers, that separate the anode from cathode. That the diaphragm allows ions to pass by electrical migration, but limit the diffusion of products. Dear students, he said that these cells contain asbestos diaphragms or diaphragm, which is formed by asbestos fiber, and what is the function of that diaphragm cell or that diaphragm? The function of that diaphragm is that it will allow the ions to pass through it, but it will limit the diffusion of products. And the next point is the anodes are made of graphite and the cathode of cast iron. When an electric current passes through the prime, the chlorine ions and sodium ions move to the electrodes. Chlorine gas is produced at anode and sodium ion at cathode react with water, forming caustic soda. Some salt remains in solution with caustic soda can be removed at larger stage or at later stage. What it means? It means chlorine will be produced at anode and sodium ion at cathode, and some impurities will remain in our solution which are removed at later stages. So in this we have discussed that in diaphragm cells there are diaphragms which are formed of asbestos fibers, and these diaphragms allow the ions to pass through it, but it forbids the products to pass through it. And we also said that anodes are made of graphite and cathodes are made of cast iron. And then at the end we have discussed that chlorine is produced at anode and sodium hydroxide is produced at cathode compartment.